Good afternoon and welcome to the 5th seminar in our Discussing AI, Automated Systems and the Future of War seminar series. I'm Toni Erskine from the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs, and I'm also Chief Investigator of the broader project on anticipating the future of war, AI, automated systems, and resort to forced decision-making, which this seminar series is part of. I'd like to begin by acknowledging and celebrating the First Nations peoples on whose traditional lands we meet this afternoon and pay my respects to elders past and present. Just to say something about the 2-year project that this seminar series is part of, it has been generously funded by the Department of Defense through a strategic policy grant, and we've actually just had a workshop over the last week as part of that project. Just to say briefly, if anyone's interested in more information on that project, we have a table set up in the back corner with some publications and information on the project. I'm absolutely delighted today to have Elke Schwarz, who's Associate Professor in Political Theory at Queen Mary, University of London. Elke's research sits at the intersection of the ethics of war and the ethics of technology, with a focus on intelligent military technologies and their impact on the politics of contemporary warfare. She's the author of the very important book, Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies. And if you haven't read this book, you absolutely must. And it's an absolute privilege to have Elke here to speak to us this afternoon. The title of her talk is Seated on the Whirlwind, Artificial Intelligence, Weapon Systems, and Moral Agency. And we were already just talking about moral agency in this context. It's going to be fascinating. I think that Elke is going to speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions. Elke, over to you, please.
Thank you so much for your kind introductory words, Toni, and thank you also for the invitation to speak today after a very productive couple of days talking all things military AI. It was really enlightening and fascinating. I also know that my fellow workshop attendees are probably slightly fatigued. I know I am a little bit, but I will try to keep you all alert. I'll try my best to keep you all alert throughout the next 30 minutes to an hour. So thank you all for coming. Perhaps a word on the title of this talk. This is a fragment of a quotation from one of the key figures of cybernetics, that is Norbert Wiener, who's at the very forefront of cybernetics. And this is from his text, The Human Use of Human Beings, Cybernetics and Society. And this is from 1950s, he wrote this. It was first published in 1950. Norbert Wiener himself has worked on many military applications of automated and autonomous type technologies. And he really highlighted, he saw a twofold peril in cybernetic technologies as they relate to computers, that they might enter as a mode of reasoning by a group of humans to, and here I quote, increase their control over the rest of the human race. And second, as a way of outsourcing complex and difficult decisions to machine authority with the questionable consequences. For the human to throw the problem of his responsibility to the machine is to cast his responsibility to the wind and find it come back seated on the whirlwind. Now, I take this to mean two things. If we choose to abdicate moral responsibility to a very narrowly conceived computational machine, we can do so, but we better make sure that we understand that the human agency and machine output are not necessarily or logically aligned. But more importantly, if we assume that responsibility can be fully outsourced to an iteratively learning machine, we might find ourselves within an ethical void. It's also possible that he was more literally referring to the Whirlwind computer, which is on the top there, which was a Cold War era machine. It was first fielded in 1951. It was one of the first digital electronic computers that operated in real time. And it's possible that he was alluding to something about that machine that I don't know anything about, but I'm taking some poetic license in being inspired by his notion of this idea of responsibility coming back seated on the whirlwind. What is important for me is that Norbert Wiener, a mathematician first and foremost, was also able to recognize that humans and machines have differing agencies in the world. They act differently within the world. They don't naturally align in their being and their existence in the world. And that the rollout of technologies was as much of a moral issue as it was a technological challenge, perhaps more so a moral issue as a technological challenge. And he says this as a mathematician first and foremost. And this was in the 1960s when the perspective on the relation between human institutions and digital technologies was nascent and was very different to what we are afforded with today. Our perspectives have already been shaped in different ways. And I argue that we are presently cultivating precisely such an ethical void. So today I want to talk to you about the catastrophic demise or failure of ethics in the accelerating human AI targeting configuration. And I want to do this in a wider and a more narrow sense. So this talk is not about technology as such, although a lot could be said about how inadequate the technologies are for reliable action in complex human contexts, or how flawed technology is churned out without good use cases in pursuit of capital gains, or how what is essentially supply chain management software is refashioned for life and death decisions. That's for some other time. These are the other things I'm working on at the moment. But today is about ethics and ethical thinking. Nonetheless, just so that we have some clarity as to what kind of systems I am concerned with and have been concerned with in my work. The systems that concern me and that I have looked at in most detail are AI-enabled weapon systems. In the broadest sense. That means systems with many components, sensor platforms, AI evaluation tools, weapons platforms, and humans, and other components in which the various elements, specifically AI decision support systems, help to establish possible targets, procure possible targets. So they make decisions about what might constitute an appropriate target to use lethal force on. These are technologies that accelerate the action chain from minutes to seconds. They increase the scope of targeting, and they increase the possibility for greater technological autonomy, meaning they remove the human increasingly from the action as such, from the action chain. But the principles of these technologies apply also to AI decision support systems, depending on the specific technologies, of course, that help towards the decision to use force itself. So the logic is very similar. And here on the screen we have Maven on top, and at the bottom is a Palantir system, the AI platform system, which purports to be able to identify threats as they emerge and then enable a chatbot kind of interface to action on those bots. It doesn't work in the real world, but that's the prototype. In my work, I've always and foremost been concerned with what effects these technological configurations have on human practices, perspectives, and human institutions, and that includes violence. When we talk about military artificial intelligence as it pertains to weapon systems, we talk about instruments of violence to be used in warfare. Instruments designed to inflict damage on human bodies and human property. And very often I find we discuss the systems in a way that is very discrete from violence directed against human edifices or as human endeavors. You know, it's often cast as something a lot more related to technological engineering itself, war as a challenge of engineering prowess as such. And that distorts the picture and enables a discourse that is removed from ethics and prioritizes the language of process, production, and workflow. In the last 12 months, I've been talking to a number of audiences, and very often audiences with some military background or affiliation, and I've really enjoyed that. And I've talked to these audiences about ethics and military AI, but I've seen one issue emerge, a question emerge with greater frequency than in the entire time since I've started studying war, violence, ethics, and technology. And there are variations to this issue or question, but the ethos, the underlying skepticism is the same regardless of its ultimate formulation. And that is, isn't ethics a luxury for warfare? Isn't ethics just for peacetime and all is fair in war? And I have been asked these questions repeatedly. Can we afford ethics in times of violence and death and destruction? Must we not do what we need to do in times of crisis? So iterations of that question keep coming up more so than ever before. There was a recent article in The Atlantic in which the author, Elliot Cohen, he's the chair for strategy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, suggests that we should put our animosities against large-scale violence aside and embrace that war is awful and that people, including civilians, will die. He couched his Machiavellian discussion in the language of responsibility. Sometimes ruinous wars just need to happen. There was also, so the article is in the middle, there was also an AI Expo conference in Washington, which was organized by former Google CEO Eric Schmidt, who's very active in the defense and the US defense landscape. So his latest venture is the Special Competitive Studies Project. It's a think tank with the explicit aim to influence policy on AI. Now, it featured an AI for Security panel on the future of geopolitics, and it was stacked with representatives from the CIA, a former general, Eric Schmidt himself, and Alex Karp, who is a co-founder of the military AI company Palantir, which I pointed to earlier. In the panel, the prospects of a hot great power war, and the prospects of mass civilian casualties underpinned by an ethos of sacrifice was raised. So a panel discussed the likelihood, let's say, that things would be absolutely terrible, people will die, but we also have the promise of precision and speed, which can mitigate all of this. So the panel itself was rather muddled. On one hand, we have this pointing towards inevitable lethality, great scales of death. On the other hand, we have a sense of precision, speed, and everything will be done because we have AI-enabled capabilities. At some point, General Milley lays out the future of war as exactly that, incredibly lethal, urban-centric, and that we are seeing previews of this kind of war right now in Gaza. And he seemed okay with that, so long as the US dominates. The tenor was a responsible state should embrace sacrifice, and Alex Karp talked about how fathers and mothers must sacrifice their sons and daughters for the future wars. And the focus was very much on developing AI capabilities to outpace China. So it was a great model, but it was a very affective kind of discussion. And there's, of course, the somewhat crazed discourse in many ways surrounding the mass deaths and suffering in Gaza. And here I just point to a tweet by Senator Lindsey Graham. He was rather unhinged in his TV interview in which he so much as suggested that Israel should just consider the nuclear option, or at least a 2,000-pound bomb, so the conflict would once and for all be done with. So a full-blown advocacy of mass violence with neither limits or qualms, quite the opposite. Somehow these violent advocacies are couched in terms of peace and responsibility. In the words of the Atlantic writer pushing back against ceasefire, he says, freezing the conflict before the destruction of Hamas as an effective military organization has no prospect of delivering anything remotely like peace. In the words of Alex Karp at the panel, he says, the peace activists are actually the pro-war activists. We are the peace activists. It has a distinct whiff of doublespeak. It's a confused discourse, to be sure, but one that seems nostalgic for some long-forgotten days of mythical military glory, or what others have called kitsch war, but now enhanced by the possibility for precision and productivity. But all the more notable is its the ahistoricity or a selective historicity of this discourse, and the fact that it ignores the plentiful scholarship, knowledge, and insights on the wider dynamics of war, violence, victory, and importantly, peace, and the crucial role ethics and the restraint in the use of violence plays in war and its aftermath. So very often wielded out, here's a perspective that unabashedly names war as a necessary and responsible activity for those tasked with ordering our global politics, and one that can be controlled because of AI. And so I want to be very clear and as emphatic as I can. War is an unfortunate human affair. It's not a technical affair. Ethics is not there to dress war up to be soft and sweet or cushy. Ethics is crucial for social functioning, nationally and internationally. And it takes into account that fighting is not a normal state, but an exception, or at least it should be. Ethics for and in war is intended to provide motivation to exercise restraint in war precisely so that an after war is possible. So that bridges can be built, so that ways forward can be found. That is the social to the technical in warfare. This is ethics as much as a type of strategy as it is a philosophical concern. I have for a very long time now, a good decade, talked about and written about how the more we discuss the advent and functionality of new and technologically sophisticated military weapons and how they fit into war and the laws of war, the more ethics becomes kind of pressed into a schema of technicity, and it becomes itself technical. Very analytical and abstracted approaches to ethics facilitate that. And I'm pointing here to a text that kind of exemplifies that. This is within the analytic and abstractive conceptions of ethics. And here the language of calculable utility and efficiency dominates, and the human is either objectified as a set of data points or a functional element in the wider digital infrastructure. So it is the forms of the discussion on moral agency and responsibilities that I'm concerned about, as they take on the markers of a technical mathematical discourse, even if they are held within a philosophical register, as it is the case within this book. And often these moral philosophical analyses are stacked with mathematical notations and a meticulous adherence to formal reasoning, as you see here. And this is, of course, an extreme example, but the mode of reasoning resonates in many such texts. I make the argument elsewhere that this is a game theoretic, economic, and ultimately algorithmic mode of thinking that has come to underwrite much of today's just war reasoning, and reasoning about justice for that matter, and that this moral lens stems from a confluence of cybernetics and nuclear violence in the 1940s and the 1950s. There's a notable uptake of moral philosophy as economics, moral reasoning under conditions of uncertainty, that was ushered in during the Cold War years, that was kind of popularized or made really palatable, if you will, by Derek Parfit and others, and it has been taken up for reasoning about life and death in various instantiations of what we like to call trolleyology, where there's always a runaway trolley somewhere, then you have to calculate how many people will die. And it is quite a popular or well-known mode of reasoning for the revisionist just war traditions, but also in the context of justifying warfare with AI-enabled autonomous weapon systems. And increasingly, these resonate with policymakers, not least because they fit within a logic of technological reasoning. But such approaches are only one way, and a very limited way at that, of thinking about ethics as it relates to war and the technologies of war. I understand ethics as a practice. And if we understand ethics as a practice, it's more open-ended, it's deliberative, and it's ultimately about contestability in many ways. How the content and form of these values and principles is ascertained is subject to contestation. And as pivotal or crucial parameters for social and political life change, ethical guidelines, their associated practices, and our human relationship with ethical values and beliefs becomes subject to inquiry. In other words, ethical reflection should inform the laws, guidelines, and rules that govern social and political life, but it must also serve to prompt critical reflection about crystallized morality, the crystallized morality of these laws, rules, and norms. And what do I mean by that? Here I draw on a Dutch military ethicist, Desiree Verwey, and she puts it very nicely. She says, law, and specifically rules of law, are crystallized morality. However, rules as crystallized morality require critical reflection, and therefore ethics, precisely because of their crystallized and therefore petrified and immobile character in an ever-changing context. Critical reflection is needed because in a world characterized by multiplicity and change, the petrification of norms will eventually lead to an unacceptable and unwarranted behavior. And I look at the two lawyers in the room here. I expect some questions. Ethics should be the alpha and omega of law, she says, and I think she's right. Neither just war principles nor IHL were intended as a tick box exercise that can be weighed, analyzed, calculated, and solved. Rather, the intent with early just war thinking was to grapple with and understand that things need to be considered carefully in morally charged actions. There's no easy answer to how many innocent people may be killed to achieve a goal. And that those making a decision to that effect must grapple with the weight of the responsibility of such actions is, to me, quite clear, but I think this notion gets lost a little bit. It's not something that is ever finished or done or can be fully satisfied. It is, in the military realm, a practice. It's an establishing of a relationship to for the permission to kill without it being murder. So it requires a weighty, open deliberation. The ethos of IHL, or the just war tradition, is intuitive to maybe most of us, maybe not, I might be wrong here. Those blameless should not have to suffer. War should not be a first resort, and there should be some rules, otherwise peace cannot be restored. Where ethics becomes techniques, this ethos is exchanged for variables that can be adjusted based on preference, interest, and aim, so that ethics can be solved rather than grappled with. In other words, it becomes subject to power, which is ultimately a key feature of nihilism, but that's a side note. But what I'm realizing, and I'm a little bit troubled by that, is that the drive towards greater autonomy in warfare and the move toward greater AI fortification and targeting and the general shift towards accelerated ways of war over any other strategic approach, there's another kind of change as it pertains to ethics in warfare, not just the technification of ethical reasoning, but the other of this technification of ethics is to make ethics obsolete, to do away with ethics entirely because it doesn't fit within the technical reason schema, at least not my conception or the conception of ethics as open-ended and as a practice. And those are the sentiments that I highlighted earlier. It becomes ever more elusive how ethics of and in war can be understood and translated into today's technologically mediated forms of war. And I say this with a particular view to the recent proliferation of the word responsibility, and I really want to highlight that because it's everywhere. This word has done a lot of heavy lifting as a substitute for ethics in the discourse of emerging technologies, and specifically military AI, albeit in various and differing and shifting ways. The notion of responsibility, or responsible AI for the military domain, is cast as many things, as a stand-in for ethical leadership, as a guide to designing ethical AI weapon systems or trustworthy AI weapon systems, as a mode of strategic differentiation, as an umbrella for aspirational norms and principles. And in doing so, it serves almost as a standalone term that simply carries its own weight without having to explain itself, perhaps already a performance of a synonym for ethical intent. But it remains substantively hollow at this stage. And I know that people are working to change that in the near future. I do remain skeptical but hopeful. But it becomes all the more important to think clearly about what moral agency and moral responsibility can realistically mean in an AI-saturated, accelerated context of warfare. I don't want to bore you with my fully fledged discussion of moral agency. I have a paper on that. So just a very brief sketch on what I mean, or what my thinking is, my broader thinking is on moral agency. Now, the field of theories on moral agency is very complex, and there are differences across geographies, schools of thought, disciplines, eras as to how moral agency can and should be defined. And there are competing accounts as to what might constitute moral agency also in a digitally mediated environment. So it's a rich scholarship that is quite thorny to get through. But in most broadly, widely accepted accounts, humans act morally in relation to other humans. That makes them moral actors rather than just actors. And that is based on human experience and all the knowledge that comprises. We relate to one another morally based on our capacity to relate. It's a reciprocal relationship of vulnerability, but also trust. Moral relations don't happen ex nihilo. As humans, we understand and are able to judge the specificities of human relations and relationality in a range of social contexts in a way that technologies are simply not able to do. They don't have any capacity to understand, and they certainly do not comprehend meaning in the same way as we comprehend meaning. Maybe to put it another way, our morality and thus our moral decision making is anchored in our history of human social relations. And it is this condition that makes us not just actors, but moral actors. So moral agency has both an individual basis on account of the fact that somebody needs to not be under duress when they engage in an action, and they have to have sufficient knowledge about the foreseeable consequences of that action. But it also has a social basis by which we anticipate the reactions of others for our actions. So moral knowledge is socially situated, and it is in part morality's social function that defines people's relations to others and to the world. Now, this makes moral agency a lot more complex than just a handful of parameters that might be pertinent to an individual rational actor. Moral agency means the capacity not just to have responsibility, but to take responsibility in relation to others, to feel the weight of that responsibility. The story is, of course, very complicated in a socio-technically complex environment when artifacts are understood to have agentic capacities, which we should take seriously, and I do. But we don't necessarily need to resort to actor network theory or post-humanist theories in order to complicate the story of moral agency. And here I come to somebody that Kirsten is very familiar with, and that is the virtue ethicist Alistair McIntyre. And he highlights a core condition of morality, namely that morality and moral agency is not simply about following established and accepted rules, but rather about reflecting about these rules and their impact on others socially. And that's particularly vital in a fragmented and highly bureaucratized modern setting in which moral agents inhabit multiple roles, which may have multiple moral ideas and values attached to them, and in which subjectivities are fractured. So for McIntyre, moral agency means engaging with the tensions that might arise in being placed in a setting with competing and irresolvable rules about what is right and wrong. And it's precisely this that makes an agent a moral agent again. The more restricted and bureaucratized the roles, the more difficult it is to exercise moral agency. But this divide itself has nonetheless a responsibility, a moral responsibility, to grapple with competing moral claims in the fractured and fragmented settings within which they find themselves. This does not absolve the divide itself from responsibility. To be responsible is to reflexively grapple with these refractions and fractures. Now, embedded within a setting that is at most, if not at all points, mediated by technological decisions, this question of being able to be reflexive, this question of moral agency becomes quite complicated and challenging on a number of levels, whether in direct operation of a system that doesn't share a cognitive basis or in shaping social settings that diminish moral agency as such. So this is not to say that all hope is lost for this reflexivity, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not very easy. Now, you forgive me this slide of shameful self-promotion, but I have written what feels like at length about these elements in the past 5 years, that human agents are cognitively unable to override computational decisions, that they cannot have enough knowledge about an AI-determined situation, no matter how transparent or explainable the AI might be, especially so in an accelerated action chain that offers outputs at scale. And the consequence of some of these is what has been reported in the context of Gaza in the Plus 972 article on Gospel, Lavender, and Where is Steady, those AI-enabled decision support systems. In that kind of context, the meaning of targeting changes from taking out an imminent threat to creating as much output as possible. More is more for actioning. It becomes about producing more targets. It's a production chain, if you will. It becomes a systematized process removed from meaning, let alone strategy. All of this complicates meaningful human control, or indeed reflexivity, and it subsumes responsibility into an overarching process of production and consumption. I'll come to a close in a minute, but I just want to very briefly dwell on this mandate of speed and its utter incompatibility with ethical deliberation. Again, I've written elsewhere how the iterative logic, technological logic of failing and learning through accelerated processing power is both the foundation of AI and the technology industry as such. This motto of move fast and break things was not simply a Silicon Valley branding byline. It is in fact a guiding principle, and increasingly so, it seems it is so for the defense domain. Here we have Deputy Defense Secretary Kathleen Hicks at a venture capital event where they talk about startups, and she literally says, yes, moving fast and breaking things is necessary to win wars, albeit within legal restrictions. So this kind of tech industry thinking finds its way into all kinds of domains, including ostensible philanthropic endeavors, but also military logics, and voices that urge the adoption of a much more agile organization of militaries and their practices proliferate these days. In fact, this chorus has been swelling in recent months, and millions of dollars in lobbying is spent in order to start changing acquisitions processes for military technology startups to thrive in the military domain, and that's a new development and quite problematic. Now, where certain technologies become more pervasive, so does the logic of their inner workings. As AI and digital technologies are dissolved into our social, political, and military institutions, the structural and logical signature of the technology becomes a substrate and infrastructure which mediates and directs ideas along its functional lines, including normative ideas. Within the logic of AI computation, normative judgments about desirable actions and practices are refracted through the lens of technological processes, business practices, and labor logics. It's not the human that defines horizons of possibility, it's the computer and its industry. But the digital protocol stands in stark contrast to the complex, slow, and irresolvable character of ethical deliberation or thinking. Solving ethically challenging tasks, including the identification of what should be enacted as a lethal target, with AI, even with the most sophisticated machine learning techniques, constitutes an abdication, I think you use that word as well, abdication of that uniquely human task to weigh and to feel the weight of a morally difficult decision for which one might bear the burden of responsibility. The consequences manifest in various ways: moral de-skilling, moral disengagement, moral agency laundering, as some have termed it. So moral agency laundering is a moral wrong which consists in distancing oneself from morally suspect actions by blaming the algorithm. So these are all serious issues worth considering and worth dwelling on when we think about the challenges of moral responsibility as we are embedded in AI-enabled weapon systems. And because all of my talks feature Günther Anders, I will close with this. In his letter to Klaus Eichmann, who was the son of Adolf Eichmann, the philosopher Günther Anders, who also wrote in the 50s and 60s, asks the question, what has made the monstrous possible? According to Anders, and he has a long he has written many pieces about this relationship between the human and technology. According to Anders, what has made the monstrous mass extinction of Jews and other groups in World War II possible was, and here I quote, the fact that we've become creatures of a technologized world, no matter in which industrialized nation we live and which political colors it flies. Such an environment, he says, privileges process over meaning and ultimately leads to the failure of being able to adequately feel, and particularly feel responsible, he says. This technological condition in which everything is drawn into the wake of computational logics of information and data produces not just the appearance of the human as equally a compilation of information and data, but the disappearance of humans as humans, and with that, a devaluation of ethics. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Elke, for a brilliant talk. We're almost out of time. I think we have about 2.5, 3 minutes left. I might just ask a final question then, Elke, just to wrap up with, you started the talk with a striking phrase that I wrote down about the catastrophic demise of ethics. And we were talking at the workshop about people who had more optimistic and more pessimistic views of what was happening with emerging technology. Can you give us reason to be hopeful? Do you think there's reason to be hopeful in addressing these issues?
I think there is. And the reason I start with, I want to talk to you about the catastrophic demise of ethics is because, if I just say, let's talk about ethics, everybody falls asleep immediately. And I think there is reason to be hopeful, but I think we have to be aware that David Wetham has written a lot on military ethics, and he says you have to train it. You have to train your ethical sensibilities, otherwise it will atrophy. And it's kind of like, he calls it the ethical memory, muscle memory kind of thing. And I think that's really important. I think we can do that because as humans, actually, we have some dynamism ourselves, or some capacity to change or produce moral imagination. And not all is lost, but I think we're on a trajectory where it becomes uncomfortable and inconvenient to talk about ethics, and the digital condition is such that it promotes convenience. And so if we find ways to sit with this inconvenience, then I think, there's hope.
That's great. I think that's a brilliant answer. Thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming this afternoon and for your challenging questions. And I hope you'll join me in thanking Elke for an outstanding, thought-provoking talk.
Thank you.